Hello and welcome to People versus the Planet, the podcast focused on exploring the complex relationship between humanity and ecology. I'm your host, Madeline Werner, and today I'll be talking with Steve Werner, an environmental consultant at Formation Environmental here in Boulder, Colorado. Formation Environmental is a rapidly growing consultant firm with offices here in Boulder, in Sacramento, California, and in Calipatria, California. They've got some other offices throughout the U.S. for specific projects, and their multidisciplinary team provides scientific, technical, and strategic expertise in environmental engineering, soil science, water resources, vegetation management, and remote sensing. I'm not going to go into that much detail for now because I'd prefer to allow Mr. Werner to talk. But I'll start off by asking you, Mr. Werner, just to introduce yourself and give us some background information and how long you've been doing this work for.
I have an educational background in molecular genetics, undergraduate and graduate work, and then a graduate degree in engineering from the Colorado School of Mines. I've been working in the environmental field for 40 years now. Hard to believe. First project was in 1981 in Durango, Colorado.
And who were you working for at that time?
That project was for the U.S. Department of Energy, and it was for a uranium mill tailings pile known as Smelter Mountain, just across from the train station in downtown Durango on the confluence of the Animas River and Lightner Creek.
Okay, cool. So would you mind telling us a little bit more about that project specifically?
So it was a big radioactive tailings pile. There was a former vanadium smelter there, and this was pre-Superfund, and it was done under a program called Uranium Mill Tailings Remedial Action, or UMTRAP, and we were doing, at the time, an environmental impact statement. I was the on-site representative. I had a background, part of my background in graduate school for molecular genetics included work in radiation ecology and radiation biology, and since this was a radioactive site, they hired me to help with that. And the end goal was to try and develop a plan to address the radioactive impacts that could come from exposure, incidental recreational activity, or unauthorized recreational activity on the pile, but then also because it was on the confluence of the Animas River and Lightner Creek, there were water quality issues both from leaching and erosion in the material. So we did a big study and ultimately decided that the most suitable action was to relocate the pile to a secure clay-lined repository in an adjacent canyon. And after that, the land was slowly incorporated into the city, and now it's, I believe, a dog park. So it was reclaimed for use after it was cleaned up. Not suitable for residential still, but fine for that kind of recreational activity.
So you were able to move that tailings pile from one location in downtown Durango that wasn't so good to a different spot?
In a secure location, built a large storage facility that was clay lined and isolated from infiltration so it wouldn't impact the groundwater resources, and capped it so there wasn't an exposure concern. And it was on federal land, so it's that land is open for hunting and hunting and other activities, hiking, and it's from an environmental transport or fate and transport perspective, it's a secure final resting place for the radioactive waste.
Is that what most of your projects look like?
My projects have varied over the last 40 years. I've largely focused on large landscape scale projects that usually involve a river. So, like the Coeur d'Alene River, the Hudson River, the Willamette River in Oregon, the Duwamish River, and Lower Duwamish Waterway in Seattle, Clark Fork River in Montana. There's always some element of cleanup where you're addressing the initial problem. And then there's secondary components related to natural resource damages where you're trying to make the public whole for any lost use of resources, say impacts to the water quality that translate to impacts to the fishery or loss of activity on the land. So usually our projects are from beginning to end turnkey. We start with the design of a remedy that's acceptable to all the stakeholders. Stakeholders include not just the federal and state agencies, but tribal agencies and local communities. We come up with a remedy that solves the environmental problems, and then to the extent we can, we try and do something beneficial for the communities and the public in conjunction with the remedy as well. So, I can give examples from all over. Downtown Denver, worked on the site that's now Elitch's. That was a former railroad maintenance yard, and also the town gas plant for the city of Denver. So there was also a small lead smelter there. So there were significant environmental concerns. We were able to do the cleanup in conjunction with the reuse of the land for Elitch's. To the extent waste needed to be hauled away or could be hauled away, they were hauled away and treated and disposed of. But a large portion of the waste were integrated in the landscape, and it wasn't really feasible to remove them, so we strategically placed parking lots and other covered facilities in those areas, incorporated certain environmental design elements to make sure that the waste would be secure into the future, put deed restrictions on those areas so they wouldn't be used for different purposes in the future. So that's a local example. Downtown Salt Lake City, large historical lead smelter from the 1800s was still present. The stack and some of the other features were still present around the millennium 2000, and at that time Utah was preparing for the Olympics, and the company that was responsible for that facility, ASARCO, American Smelting and Refining Company, wanted to do something to clean it up, address the issues, and we were able to come up with a plan where we demolished the stack, cleaned up the smelter site, and to accommodate the needs for the Olympics, a light rail facility was built on the former smelter site. The parking lot was incorporated in a on-site repository for residual smelter waste, and so the company saved some money. The cost of cleanup wasn't prohibitive. The community gained a light rail facility out of it, time for the Olympics. So usually we're trying to find those kind of win-win situations that make things work for the company, or in the CERCLA jargon, the PRP, the potentially responsible party. In other words, the folks that have to pay for it, and the local stakeholders and EPA or other federal agencies. So
That's really great. Do you have another example of some more projects like that?
let's see, another one that was really interesting for me, and probably I think the greatest benefit for the community was for the Bunker Hill Superfund site in the Coeur d'Alene Basin. That's a massive mining district and industrial facility in northern Idaho where a variety of mines and associated mills dumped millions of tons of tailings into the Coeur d'Alene River, up at the headwaters near Montana, and those tailings moved all the way down into Washington State across the panhandle of Idaho. Massive cleanup, 1,700 square miles. There are also industrial facilities, lead smelter, silver refinery, cobalt plant, electrolytic zinc plant up near the mines that had to be cleaned up. And ultimately that went to court, and most of the companies involved went into bankruptcy. But one of our clients was Union Pacific Railroad. They had built in the late 1800s a 72-mile branch line that went from Washington, the state of Washington, across Lake Coeur d'Alene, big swing span bridge, and then followed the Coeur d'Alene River up into the headwaters to the Montana border. The rail bed itself, as I said, was built with mining waste, highly contaminated, but very difficult to remediate because it actually followed the river. There were no roads near it at all. It was still being sporadically used to serve the mines, but the mines were all closing down in that area, and the local communities were trying to figure out how to survive. Their economies had fallen apart, and they selected tourism as their next force for driving the local economy. Union Pacific, rather than getting involved in the litigation, wanted to settle the case and find a cleanup that was acceptable. One option would have been to improve the rail line and put in environmental controls to make sure that the mining waste that was integrated in the rail bed didn't impact the adjacent river or didn't create exposure concerns for the community. But that really didn't make sense because as I said, the mines were closing down, and it would have been a very nice functional industrial rail line with no industry at the other end. So the concept we came up with was to put the rail line into the Rails to Trails Conservancy, rail banking. So even though that's no longer used as a railroad, it's still there, available. The branch is still there, available into the future if things change and a rail line is needed there. But in the meantime, it was converted to a trail, a multi-use trail, 72 miles long from the high in the headwaters all the way down across Lake Coeur d'Alene. The historic swing span bridge was fixed and adjusted, so it was incorporated into the trail, and then a whole myriad of environmental engineering features were included in the trail design. So the waste itself was capped with an asphalt cap for 72 miles. All the embankments that were near the river were reinforced and covered with clean material. Any hot spots or problematic areas that were susceptible to potential future transport because of erosion or leaching were addressed. Where the trail passed through a number of communities, and the right-of-way associated with the trail was wider in those communities. So those were cleaned up and incorporated into green space. So you had the trail and green space next to it. Interpretive center was put in where the trail comes close to the Coeur d'Alene Mission, which was very important to the Coeur d'Alene tribe, who were one of the stakeholders in this process. Every year they did a pilgrimage from their tribal lands in Washington along the Coeur d'Alene River to the mission site. Many of the tribal members converted to Christianity, a long, long time ago when the mission was first constructed. So a sacred piece of ground for them that was incorporated into the whole concept with a interpretive center. The removal of the rail line allowed them to go back to their pre-railroad route for the pilgrimage, and they could use the trail. There were certain features incorporated in the trail to make it easier for them to access that historic site for their pilgrimage on horseback. I think I already mentioned that the communities and green space were incorporated, and other tie-ins to other recreational features were included. In Kellogg, Idaho, where the smelter was and the original 21 square mile footprint for the Bunker Hill Superfund site started. Also remediated a large area of tailings in the center of town, and that was used as a base for a new gondola to serve expansion of what had been a historic company-owned ski area. So the mining company actually had a small ski area for their employees that had been closed down. That was rejuvenated, and federal grants were used by the community in conjunction with the company's cleanup to build a really, beautiful gondola base and lodge on contaminated ground that was cleaned up or prepared for that purpose. Golf course was put in near the former smelter site, incorporating company land. So that was just a great outcome. Very difficult to negotiate with all the different stakeholders. Tribal entities in particular, had a lot of concerns about moving forward with the project, but in the end, preserving the rail line, it just made sense, and everybody got behind it, and now it's probably one of the most beautiful trails in the world. It's a $50 million investment by Union Pacific Railroad to build that trail and the amenities. So that's a great story. Another big success for the local stakeholders in the community was the Anaconda smelter site on the Clark Fork River in Montana, or tributary to Clark Fork River in Montana, where it really wasn't practical to clean up all the waste that were present in that area and move them to a repository. But we came up with the concept of building a golf course. And the PRP at the time was a company called Atlantic Richfield. It's now part of British Petroleum. They got behind the idea of building a golf course for the community to the extent that they hired Jack Nicklaus and paid him a very large fee to design a world-class golf course. We incorporated a lot of the waste features into the golf course design. There's remnants of the historic mining features and the smelter facility incorporated into the golf course design. Even use some of the waste that is innocuous, like the slag. It's a glassy sand-like material, black. That was used in the sand traps instead of sand. So there's a connection to the historic past. But I can go on and on with projects like that worked out well for everybody involved, and offered some final benefit to the community.
Who funded that project, and who owns the golf course?
As I mentioned a minute ago, the project was funded by the responsible party, was Atlantic Richfield Company. Atlantic Richfield Company wasn't really a mining or a smelting company, but in the 1970s, they decided to diversify. They were an oil and gas company, and they bought Anaconda Mining Company, which was a copper mining company, and had the ownership of the facility in Anaconda, as well as a lot of the historic mining and milling facilities in Butte, Montana, which is just down the road. Okay, it seemed like a good idea probably to get into the copper business and lead business, possibly, to the gas companies at the time. Leaded gas was still being used. But Superfund, wasn't there. The environmental laws weren't there. So what ultimately happened is they bought the mining company, and through buying the mining company, they bought literally billions of dollars in environmental liability. The Clark Fork Superfund site. So they were looking for ways to address their liability and be responsible about it, but not put the company into bankruptcy. And the golf course was one way for them to do it. Part of a much larger project. The land was donated to, and the golf course was donated to the city of Anaconda, and a trust was established to help the city fund the annual operation and maintenance of the golf course. And now the golf course is revenue generating, and in conjunction with the trust, they have at least for the near term, they have adequate money to operate the golf course. It's really amazing. It's a world-class golf course with the ties to the historical activities in the middle of nowhere in Montana.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So I guess I had a question referring to something you said before. When you are capping a site that has been contaminated, is asphalt kind of the cheapest and most effective route to go with if you're dealing with a site that's been contaminated?
Well, no. I mean, those are just examples where they could be integrated with the use that, excuse me, for the trail. Asphalt cover is more durable. Could have had just a clean barrier of cinder rock or limestone, but it's not going to be as durable, and it's not going to be as suitable for different uses. Much more challenging for cycling and a greater investment for maintenance. So in that case, the asphalt was appropriate for the future use. There's always a fund established for long-term O&M. So in addition to all the money that Union Pacific spent on building the trail, they also funded an operation and maintenance trust. So the entities that received the trail, in this case the state of Idaho Parks and Recs and the Coeur d'Alene Tribe, have adequate funding to operate and maintain the trail into the future. The entities are also usually on the hook, if you will, for any catastrophe that would occur in the future. But when you're dealing with these historical sites that have massive footprints and very, very large amounts of waste involved, and there are no real treatment options, those kind of creative in-place stabilization actions are definitely more economical. And if you were trying to go to the extreme end of removal of millions and millions and millions of tons of material and consolidation in some type of landfill or repository, there's just the money's not available, you'll spend all your money on litigation rather than on a reasonable solution. So, but that's the trick, is to find something that's acceptable to the agencies, acceptable to the local stakeholders. That's very important, and that the companies can afford to pay for.
Is the environment considered like a stakeholder? Like, would the EPA be representative of that, or?
EPA is always there. EPA is the reason for the cleanup. So the number one focus for the actions are actually controlling the release of and exposure to the hazardous substances associated with the facilities. So none of this happens without a foundation that addresses the environmental concerns and the human health concerns. So what I've been talking about are creative ways to actually get value rather than just building some kind of ugly but stable repository. We're trying to find a way that brings value to the community as well. So in all of these cleanups, there are different features that are specifically and solely aimed at reducing exposure, reducing release and transport of contaminants. Almost all of the major projects I've been involved in over the years revolve around a river, and so surface water impacts are first and foremost. Groundwater impacts are a major part of all these sites. So the primary thing is to look at alternatives that control control release of contaminants and exposure to contaminants, as I said before, and address any future concerns with regard to the site. So, I mean, on these sites I've been talking about, the mining sites in particular, there's acid mine drainage component coming from the mines, the old underground workings. We've used wetlands for treatment and removal of metals from that drainage, because can be a good long-term solution. It's much better than a treatment plant, and you can incorporate it into the landscape. We use retention basins to deal with runoff from mining sites, and those can be incorporated into the landscape and be used to develop habitat, wildlife habitat. We've done a lot of restoration of streams in conjunction with the cleanup, so we're not only taking mine waste out of the streams, we're rebuilding the natural stream structure and creating fish habitat. So all of those elements are there as well from an ecological perspective.
So if you plan to use like wetlands for water treatment purposes, would those wetlands eventually be accessible to the public for recreation?
Yeah, usually the metals are bound up in some geochemical form where they're stable, and there's always a concern that they become an attractive nuisance for wildlife. But typically, there's some organic medium that can be cleaned up and removed and regenerated as the metals accumulate, if that's a concern. The wetlands really aren't designed, the treatment wetlands really aren't designed for recreation or human activity, but they do feed into bodies of water that are important for recreation. So it's really an upstream cleanup component that helps the downstream water quality.
So when you say attractive nuisance to wildlife, what do you mean by that?
Well, the concern is that if you build a wetland and you're capturing the hazardous substance in that wetland, the metals, that the concentrations will build up over time, and but yet, where they're accumulating is an environment that's often attractive to wildlife, a wetland. So you want to make sure that you're not creating a situation where you're accumulating the hazardous substance, the metals, at high concentrations, and then at the same time you're drawing in wildlife who becomes exposed to those elevated metals concentrations. So you have to be careful. So you're creating habitat from some wildlife's perspective, but it's also has a treatment aspect to it. So you got to be very careful about that.
Does that ever happen that the wildlife has been affected?
Not significantly, no. I mean, there have been some individual exposure issues or concerns, but nothing at a population level, and they're usually monitored, and even though they're wetlands and they're called passive treatment systems, they're still monitoring an activity to make sure that, or to try and make sure that kind of exposure doesn't occur. But in the end, it's a net benefit relative to what existed before. You minimize that exposure through the design and construction, and you monitor to make sure it doesn't happen in the future, and the benefit of that facility is far greater than what existed before the treatment system was in place.
So when you're looking at a site for the first time or a project for the first time, how do you break down the different issues? Do you look at water separately than soils or air pollution, and then, or do you look at it as a whole system?
Well, usually we look at it as a whole system. It's integrated because the solution has to be integrated. And air, because of these cleanups, most of the time there's not active industry involved anymore. They're historical facilities. So the air issues are usually related to dust or resuspension of contaminated material. So that leads you back to the soil. The impacts to groundwater and surface water usually are coming from those original source materials. For groundwater, leaching of contaminants into the groundwater system. For surface water, leaching and active erosion of it. So you got to start with the big picture in terms of what the environmental problems are, what are the source materials, what are the pathways for release and transport that you're trying to address, and then at the same time you're trying to step back and look at issues like future land use. How do you minimize the footprint that's being impacted by the ultimate remedy, and try and incorporate some of the elements we just talked about, where there's ultimately some beneficial use to the land as opposed to it just being occupied by some structure that's associated with the cleanup.
What other options for reuse are there? If recreation seems like it would be one that's used commonly.
Recreation's a good one because the exposure concerns aren't as great as residential, but and the exposure concerns are driven by just people, being present and having contact with contaminated soil or waters, and from a recreational perspective, that amount of contact time is more limited and the risks are reduced. But we've done quite a number of projects where residential use of the land was involved. It's a higher cleanup standard. Done huge projects in urban areas where the soil in residential areas has been impacted by historic industrial emissions. Lead smelters are a big problem, and over maybe 100 years of operation for a lead smelter, a significant amount of dust, lead containing dust, has fallen on the surrounding communities. Globeville here in Denver, we worked on that. In those areas, it's the existing use is residential, and you're just coming in and removing the contamination. And usually what happens is the soil in the yard is removed, and new soil, clean soil, is put in, and it's resodded. So the use is the residential use for the actual industrial facility often doesn't happen because the setting isn't great for it and there's residual contamination. But if the value of the property is high enough and the location is where it's very desirable for residential use, then the money drives the cleanup in that direction, and residential use occurs.
So it's probably takes longer and more expensive, but if payoff is worth it.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily take longer, but it's more expensive because you're oftentimes cleaning it up to a very high standard, background pre-industrial activity. You're oftentimes having to treat or relocate the waste, and if it's significant volumes, that drives the cost up. There's a lot of disturbance associated with those kinds of activities in terms of multi-year construction and hauling of waste in trucks through residential areas and things like that. So there's a lot of different factors that are considered in terms of short-term, long-term risks, economic, those are risks to the public, economic viability, the practicability of it. Can you really do it? Can you really clean it up to the level you want to clean it up? I think the way I look at it is oftentimes you're trying to find something that works for all the stakeholders, and these cleanups are hugely expensive, and that many times the companies they're not trying to duck their responsibility. I've never worked for a company that's trying to duck their responsibility or liability, but they have limited resources as well. Let's just use this sort of imaginary scale where if you clean up to a 95% level, it's suitable for recreational use, right? And there's on-site repositories and things like that. Every additional percentage of efficiency for the cleanup, it goes up almost at a geometric progression in terms of cost. So it might cost you $10 million to have what people would consider a 95% solution in terms of addressing the contamination. 96% or 97% might be $100 million in cost. So the closer you get to cleaning up to background, pre-industrial activity, pre-development of the landscape, the more expensive it gets at some rapidly increasing scale. And oftentimes at these sites, it's not just one source. You know, in Seattle, for example, working on the Lower Duwamish Waterway, that's where the Boeing facilities, airplane construction facilities, were that fueled World War II and before, and you know, up until recently involved a lot of airplane production. Well, that's one industry contributing to that water contamination in that waterway, and the contamination in the sediment in that waterway in particular. But there were hundreds of other industries along that same waterway that contributed contamination. So another big part of these major landscape scale cleanups, especially in urban environments, is called allocation, and figuring out who pays what share of that cleanup. That's another very complicated issue, and on all these matters that we're talking about, unfortunately, I've been an expert witness in court trying to help solve these issues from a legal perspective in terms of liability and who pays for the cleanups and how much is everybody's share. So,
Do you think that in the future there will be similar cases involving air pollution, carbon emissions, where responsibilities could be allocated to?
yeah, there already are, I should say. So, you know, we have a group that's solely water resources, so we're not dealing with contamination, we're just dealing with the management of the water resource. One of our big areas of expertise has to do with what are called the terminal lakes in California. They're drying up. Salton Sea is a famous one, Mono Lake, Owens Lake. They were created, you know, quite some time ago, and the water that recharges those features either was artificially directed there historically, like the case of the Salton Sea, and no longer exists, or it's been diverted for agricultural use, other activities. So the lakes are shrinking. You know, a surprising aspect of that is air quality. So those lakes, because they're drying up, are creating these massive dust fields, and the dust is contributing to air quality issues in the LA basin, right? That's an apportionment issue where the dust is responsible for a certain part of it. Some of that dust comes from the newly formed playa as the lake dries up, and is responsibility of the irrigation district or the California Water Board. Some of it's from adjacent federal lands that have had increased recreational activity, and you know, off-road vehicles and stuff that have changed the landscape and created dust sources there. So you're dealing with an apportionment at that level. There's also a lot of apportionment with regard to other pollutants or carbon dioxide generation in different air districts. So it's a little bit different because it's active. It's not looking at things from a historical perspective, but there's always going to be that fight about who's causing the impact and whose responsibility it is to pay for it, whether it's historical or ongoing air or water pollution.
Are there other active sites you've worked on?
Active meaning
Like still in use?
industrial facilities that are still going, or mining activities? Yeah, there's a number of them where the facilities have had a long history, and part of the facility is historical and it needs to be cleaned up, and part of the facility is still operating. And so you have this overlap of regulatory considerations where the operating part of the facility falls under one regulatory program and the historical part might fall under Superfund. That's fairly common in the mining world too, because you might have a mining district where the mining started 50 or 100 years ago and there's still active mining, and the mining practices that were used 50 to 100 years ago are much different than the current mining practices. The environmental permitting process for the active part of the mine is much different than the historical. So you can have a new mine right next to an inactive historical mine, and you're helping with the cleanup of the historical mining features, but at the same time you're trying to integrate a cleanup plan that recognizes the active mining and solve both the problem of the historical mining and making sure that the future mining minimizes the potential for long-term problems.
So, are there any cases where you try to transition industries, like, I guess, bad industries into different ones or good industries? Like,
No, we're not. I mean, we don't do that. We do help with recycling, reuse. We've had a number of mining sites where the historical waste as part of the cleanup could be reprocessed and bring some economic value. So that's similar to your question you're posing. The reuse of the landscape. There's been some, but not very many, where the facilities have been reused. I was thinking more about your question on residential use. One of the areas where that's become more common at our former military bases. So Lowry here in downtown Denver, I worked on that when it was still a active military base, addressing the contamination associated with that facility, and large parts of that base were incorporated into residential development. So there's a golf course there as well. So there's, just jumping back to the residential question, but in terms of us modifying existing industries, we don't really get involved in that. We've been involved in helping industries improve, and we've been involved in industries that are related to the cleanup that also generate some economic benefit to the community, like the recycling of mine waste issues we talked about.
what's an example of recycling the mine waste, using it to, like, what can you use that for?
So when mining occurs, they extract the ore from the ground. The ore isn't ready to be turned into the metal of value, so they mill it. They basically grind it up and they separate the pieces with the higher concentration of metal from the pieces with less. They dispose of the pieces that are left, either in big piles or in impoundments or historically in rivers, and that material still has significant amount of metals in it, and the technology for extracting metals relative to 50 to 100 years ago has improved. So they'll reprocess or remill the historical tailings to extract more metal, and then another use is then that the tailings that are generated from the new process have very low metals concentrations in them and can be used to create aggregate or cement or as backfill material. So there's a way to take a waste and turn it into multiple products that have economic value. So that's one example.
What was the Globeville project you were brought up?
It's one of many smelter sites we've worked on. So in Globeville, in northeast Denver, there was a historical lead smelter, and it impacted the neighborhood's fallout from the smelter. Particles from the smelter that were very high in lead concentration impacted the yards. Basically, it lands directly on the yards, or it lands on people's roofs, and or lands on people's roofs and is washed off the roof into the yard. So you have areas of soil in people's yards that have very high lead concentration, and that poses a lot of problems when you have kids out playing in the yard or gardening or other activities where people are incidentally ingesting that soil. It's on their hands, or the kids are out literally being kids and ingesting dirt. And so the usual or typical solution for those problems is just to go in and remove the soil from the yard that's contaminated. Can be used, because it's not tremendously high in lead concentration, it often can be used as daily cover in the landfill, but it's hauled off either put in a landfill or some kind of secure repository. Clean soil's brought in and the yards are resodded, and the safe and residential environments restored. We've done a lot of those projects in different cities: Leadville, Omaha, Nebraska, Tacoma, Washington, Everett, Washington. The list goes on. There are a lot of historical lead and copper smelters around the country that had unintended impacts on the surrounding residential area.
Are there situations where sites can't be touched, or like where the damage has gone too far?
Well, it's not really a matter of the damage going too far. It's just that the conditions are such that it's not practicable to clean it up for all uses. So we have, a big one that's well known down the road. Rocky Mountain Arsenal is, over off of 270 across from the old airport, or north of the old airport. That site is very heavily contaminated, and it's not realistic to try and clean up that footprint to bring it back for all uses. And right now it's been cleaned up to a reasonable level, and it's a wildlife preserve. Rocky Flats is another example of that, where the radioactive waste are such that you can clean it up reasonably to make it safe for recreational activity or certain forms of recreational activity, but it's highly unlikely that the resources would be available, nor would it make sense to try and clean that land property up for future residential use.
With that, we're going to wrap up and conclude this week's podcast episode. I would like to say a big thank you to Mr. Werner for joining us on the show today. And listeners, you can tune in next week as we discuss climate change effects in the COVID-19 era.